All right, share screen. Okay, I assume you can see it now, right? All right, I have the chat open if there's any problems. In any event, um, so what we said was that there he explained the whole nimshal of the word baruch. If you take away the rest of the letters, then the letter base remains on its own. Then obviously it doesn't have the whole concept of the word Baruch. Yes, it has its own idea of what the letter base means, but it doesn't contain really the entire concept of Baruch. And even more so, it doesn't contain the entire concept that's beyond the word of Baruch that could possibly be expressed in a different word. Like, for instance, Baruch is always explained as the Indian of Amshocha. So perhaps the word Amshocha could express that equally. But in any event, the in the previous chapter, so he started explaining that moshel, and he brought another moshel as well, because that moshel seemed to be more of an appropriate moshel for the Indian of Kalim rather than for the Indian of Oirois, because the Oisis are more Kalim than they are Oirois. So he explained another moshel, and the other moshel was the moshel of a Rav, giving over to his Talmud, and he gives over one concept at a time, one Indian at a time, but the Talmud only gets to understand the entire concept at the end when he has all the little parts that make up the entire concept, all the subheadings, so to speak, that make up the main heading, then he'll understand the concept. Even so, what he understands of it is much less than what the Rav understands, because the Rav understands that concept in the context of a whole slew of concepts which all work together as the major Indian or a major theme. Now he's going to use these two Misholim to explain to us two kinds of tzimtzumim that there are in the Oiris. The first is a tzimtzum arishoin, and then there's a tzimtzum in the Shorish Hakav, and that's what we're going to explain shortly. Okay, v'yesh loymar dugma mizeh. So the dugma of these Misholim that we gave previously, be'eses v'zagnuzos, we can understand in the eses v'zagnuzos, including the Orient Sof Tzimtzum, the way they are, including the Orient Sof Tzimtzum. Now, what are the eses v'zagnuzos that are included in the Orient Sof before the Tzimtzum, that are integrated into the Orient Sof? So he explained previously in the previous parak that this is the in of alois harotzoin, the arousing. It's aroused in his will that he wants a certain Indian, a certain result. What's that arousal in the at the moment? It's only in the Indian of will, but since it's the arousal for something specific, that'll be after the tzimtzum. Even before the tzimtzum, there's a certain tziyur. That's called the esesviris agnuzos. There's a tziyur in the or, and this is all in the or that's shayach lo'olamis, not in the or shebegilu la'atzmoi, but in the or shayach lo'olamis. The or shebegilu la'atzmoi, the spheros ain't kates, not just 10 spheros, the 10 spheros agnuzos. Anyway, he's going to explain this Indian at greater length now. So Yuvin Ba'orin Sof, including Ba'orin Sof Shnehatzim, Tum Shayu B'chinas Achtus, that in the Orin Sof there B'chinas Achtus. Why is B'chinas Achtus? Because of a completely B'chinas Bittel, it's impossible to distinguish one from the other. The Az Hayabahim Gilu Or, because of the Gilu Or that was Metzaref all the oises together as one, it was impossible to separate them and to view them as one thing because they were completely bottled in the higher or itself. Motions Baal Perchov Gimel Chov Hey. In Levana or Shayabahem Buchinas or Pnimi, besides the or Pnimi, for example, the meaning of the word Baruch is the or Pnimi in the word Baruch. But then there's an or Makif, which contains the word Baruch and is part of a much broader picture. So he's going to explain this, and it goes into quite a lengthy explanation of this idea, as we will see shortly. The intention was that there should be Esses Spherois in Olam Atzilus because he wanted Olam as Mugbolim. So there would be Esses Spherois, but Masha and Essa Dafka. And there would be Dafka 10 Spherois, so not more than 10, as the Sefer Yetzirah says, 10 not 9, 10 not 11, or 10 not 11, 10 not 9. We explained that before. Okay, so we're talking here about an or pnimi. An or pnimi means that there's esespheros, and the esespheros are distinguishable one from the other. That would be the end result. That's what he wanted. And that's the or pnimi in them is like the meaning of the word, as we explained before. V'od furthermore, hayabahem bechinas ha'or ha'klali ha'olah ha'kulona. There was an or klali that is beyond, that transcends the meaning of that particular word. There's an or klali. Let's say the or klali in this particular case would be, for example, the whole Indian of the word Baruch. We know what that means, to be nimshach and blessings and so on and so forth, whatever the translation of the word Baruch that we would use. But there's an or klali ha'olah kulona. What's that or klali? That or klali could be, for example, the whole concept of transmitting from one madrega to another. Let's say from a Rav to a Talmid, transmit the concept of transmission of blessing, the concept of transmission of or. So it's not a particular or that's transmitted. It's not an or. It's not a word in the or. It's not the word baruch. It's not the word bayit, or whatever it may happen to be. But the whole concept of transmission, the whole concept of ishtalshel satayra. Ishtalshel is the wrong word, but the transmission of the Torah from one generation to another. It's the entire Torah. It's the entire thing. It's the concept of transmission altogether. For example, okay, so that would be the or ha'oila al kulon. The yesh loimar shahaya meir alehem begiloi ha'or shebechinas orein sof. On the Esesphiros Agnuzois, not only was the inyan of the or of the spherois each sphera, and not only was there an inyan of Eses Frisak Nuzos as one unit, in other words, the inyan of a tziyur in the or, a particular tziyur in the or, which had 10 qualities to it, which is the or pnimi. But there's an or ha'oila al kulona, and we're going to explain what that is. Yesh lem shayameh alayim bagilo or shebechinas or ein sof, shu bechinas bli gvul mamash. So that or habli gvul, in other words, in the or hashayach la'olemis, that is nevertheless part of the whole inyan of or ein sof. Alpha P, that it's the lowest part of the or ein sof, it's nevertheless at this point in time before the tzimtzum, it's completely bottled in the or ein sof, in the highest level of the or ein sof, in the or shema'en ha'ma'or, as I'll explain shortly. While the hatzimtzum lios nimshach sfira achas, as we explained before, the Indian of the Tzimtzum would be as if you were mamshich one single sphere at a time, one single sphere from the Or HaKlali. Sphera achas levada, hine levad bechinas miuta or pnimi. Not only is it going to be a reduction in the or pnimi, because the word baruch, where the in the marshal, the word baruch is now missing the letter base. The letter base is separated from the rest of the word Baruch. So the whole concept of Baruch doesn't apply now because it's only a letter base. And therefore, even though it could fit into the word Baruch, it doesn't fit in there now because it's been separated. So it's like separating out one ois from a word. Not only did that happen, odzois, furthermore, on an even greater scale, the whole concept of or, the or ein sof was nistalik completely. In other words, it wasn't just that the inyan of Baruch was nistalik by breaking the word into its constituent letters, but the whole inyan of, let's say, transmission, or the whole inyan of relationship, the whole inyan of communication was no longer there. That was the tzimtzum. All right, so he's going to give an example exactly from the word Baruch. V'hinei b'moshel t'tevas Baruch, in the moshel that we gave before of the word Baruch Hanal shemafrid moisachas b'chaveta me'ateva. When you separate that one word, one letter from the entire word, harimistalik memela or ha'olot kulona gamken. Not only is the meaning of the word not there anymore, but the or ha'olot kulona is also disappears. And he's going to explain more about this in of the or ha'olot kulona shortly. Ulamaila. So when it comes to the nimshal, in other words, lamaila, hen shnei tzimtzumim. There are actually two tzimtzumim. that take place. There's a Tzimtzum HaRishon and there's a Tzimtzum in the Shorish HaKav. Ein Shnei Tzimtzumim. Ha'aleph, HaTzimtzum Ha'Ein Sof. That's a Tzimtzum HaRishon. Tzimtzum Ha'Ein Sof. Hu Sha'or Shebefnim Ein Sof, Nistalek v'Nis'alem, Shenichal B'Atzmusai. This is actually the Chidush in the Alter Rebbe's explanation of the Tzimtzum. Al Kopanim is a Chidush in the explanation. It seems that this is mamish what the Arizal meant. And because of the kitzah there, the kitzah loshon of Rabbi Chaim Vital, it didn't come out in such a way that it would be understood by everyone in this way, but it certainly was understood by the Alter Rebbe this way, that the or was not nistalik, it was nichlal ba'atzmuso. In other words, it was just moved up to a higher level. It wasn't moved away, like the Gra says. Now, again, there are other people that say that the Gra didn't actually say that. It's a misunderstanding of the Gra, but Pashtus, that's what the Gra said. And he actually fought about it. And he, in fact, had the Tanya burned because of because of this Indian. The Isnagdus was pretty strong. And when the Alter Rebbe, I mentioned this one time previously, the Alter Rebbe and Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk wanted to go and explain the shit of the Baal Shem Tov in the Indian of the Tzimtzum, he left town. He didn't want to see them. He didn't want to hear them. So there are those that say that his mother told him he had to leave town. So he obeyed his mother, Kibbud Aim, and therefore Kibbud Aim is more important than Sholem in the Jewish Machane, apparently, in any event. That's what happened. He disappeared.
I did hear a version that it was already under Cherem, and so he was observing his own rules of his own Cherem.
Yeah. There's lots of explanations. Yeah, okay. Fair enough. But who makes the Cherem can mevatel Cherem also,
Right.
For the sake of Shalom and so on and so forth. Look, I understand. We can't say that he was completely,
the other interesting point,
kind of situation.
the other point that I heard from Moshe Soloveitchik is that Grove was somehow under impression, and he apparently wrote it in some letter or letters maybe, that that he accused Alter Rebbe that he was Hushpami Spinoza. This idea, apparently Spinoza promoted the idea of God and nature. So there was
I mean, that's there's tremendous differences between Alter Rebbe and Spinoza, but anyway, for him, God was only in nature. The Alter Rebbe understood that there's an Indian of Bereshis ba Elokim. That's the Indian of nature, Hateva, Gematria Hateva, Elokim, Gematria Hateva. And then there's Ba'asois Havaya Elokim Es Shoretz Eretz V'Shamayim.
Apparently, there is a book on this topic, a Chabad side book that came out recently in Israel about this.
Oh, so I'd be interested to see.
So there is the Yesh Raglaim Ledover, in other words.
Yeah. Yesh Raglaim Ledover. We can't judge it from our perspective, but. Nevertheless, Chassin would still say, for the sake of Shalom, you should at least have spoken to them. That was, even if it would have been, on the other side of a curtain, that would have nevertheless been with his back to them or whatever. That would have nevertheless, settled a lot of inyonim. In any event, it's always hindsight is 20/20, as they say. All right, so the first thing was the Orein Sof that was Nistalik v'Nisalim shenichla ba'atzmusay. That's Alter Rebbe's chidush, because there's nowhere outside of himself that he can put it, so to speak. So it's nichla ba'atzmusay in a higher madrega v'abeis, and the second tzimtzum b'sherish u'makor hakav, the tzimtzum of the kav, the makor hakav. Why? Because the kav, instead of being the kav is nogeya in the Orein Sof, in the Or HaSoivev. In fact, the Or that was nistalik from the Halal, the Or that HaKadosh Baruch was masalek from the Halal, that is called the Igul HaGadol. Called the Igul HaGadol. which is the Or HaSoivev HaKloli. Now, the Kav begins in the Or HaSoivev HaKloli, in the Or of the Igul HaGodel. Only what? The Kav is a Kav Dak, right? Sheyesh bo malo umata. So the Indian of the Kav is that it's already matumtzam from even from the Or of the Igul HaGodel, and the Or of the Igul HaGodel was the Or that was matumtzam. That was the first Tzimtzum. The Or of the Igul HaGodel made the Tzimtzum made the Or of the Igul HaGodel, the first Tzimtzum. Second Tzimtzum is that the Kav, which is Nogain, or the Igul HaGodel, is nevertheless a Kav Dak, Sheyesh bo Malo Mata. The Igul HaGodel doesn't have Malo Mata, it's an Igul. And it wasn't an Or Dak. Masha'aikan, the Kav is an Or Dak, and the way the subsequent Mukubolim explain it is that it was that the Kav is comprised of Nekudois. Right, the kav is comprised of nekudos. What's a nekuda? A nekuda is an or matzumtzam b'yoser. Right, and with a series of nekudos, that's what makes the kav. Okay, in any event, he's not going to go into this now. We'll much later in Ayin Beis, he goes into this in much greater detail. But in any event, only a single sphere, so to speak, would be nimshach. I say so to speak because the covers mamshich all the spheroids, but it's ki'ilu, he's giving the marshal of just the letter base from Baruch. V'lobi arvus kulam yachad, and not all with all of the bechinas and tchunois all together. It was nimshach hakav dak. And the way it was nimshach was that what's the difference between a kav and let's say kav and a shetach, right? Shetach means an area. So the difference, I don't want to, I can't explain it mathematically, and I don't want to get into the mathematics of it. But a point in a kav is only connected to the point before and the point after. Masha'inkain, let's say a molecule of water in a space is connected in some sense or another to all the other molecules, to every molecule, even though it's only surrounded on. It's only surrounded by molecules wherever it is, but in a sense, it's connected to all the other drops of water, all the other molecules of water. Why? Because it's all one thing, and they're all in this together, so to speak. Masha'ik and a kav is only connected on two sides: what's above it and what's below it, and what it is. So it's like one dimension, two-dimensional. Okay. Lobis arbus kulam beyachad, and not all of them together. V'yesh loymar. Could say as follows: Shaya Meir or Habligvul Mamish, that when the or Habligvul, which the Tzimtzum removed, but before the Tzimtzum, when there was the or Habligvul was Meir Mamish, Hayu Ha'eses Firoes Betelim Legamri. They weren't visible at all. They were completely bottled. They were nichlal in the or, Kapitel Ziva Shemesh B'Shemesh, like the ray of the sun in the sun, which is not recognizable in the sun itself. It's not recognizable as an individual ray. It's only afterwards that it's called an individual ray. But as if the ray is in the sun, that's how it will be the Esesfiris and the Gnuzas in the Or Ein Sof. First, you had to have the concealment of the Or HaBligvul. And then afterwards, the subsequent Tzimtzum of the Kav, which is the Tzimtzum of the Esesfiris HaGnuzois. It's basically the same thing, because the Esesfiris HaGnuzois is the Tziyur of the Or before the Tzimtzum. In other words, the Tziyur of the Kav before the Tzimtzum. Va'inyan hu is as follows, skip the brackets. It's just a reference. The Hinan is Baal El Perik Design. The Esesfiris HaGnuzois and Bechinis Aliyas HaRotzon. That, as I mentioned before at the beginning, the Esesfiris HaGnuzas are called the Inyan of Aliyas HaRotzon. Aliyas HaRotzon of Hashem, Sha'ala B'ritzoyin HaPoshut Laha'atzil Chulu. It arose in his Ratzon to Ma'atzil Olam HaAtzilus and to Boyer Olam HaBriya and so on and so forth. Ala B'ritzoyin HaPoshut Laha'atzil Chulu. We're talking about still before the Tzimtzum. Va'ein Sof HaBligvul, but nevertheless, even before the Tzimtzum, since it arose in his Ratzon, there's a Tziyur to the Ratzon. Therefore, there's a Tziyur in a sense to this Esesfiris HaGnuzois and not Sfiris and Kates. והאין סוף הבליגבול, זה מה שלמעלה מאלוס הרצון. The Or Ein Sof is למעלה מאלוס הרצון, is a tzir. There's no tzir in the Or Ein Sof. V'sham, in the Or HaBligvul, Or Ein Sof HaBligvul, Sham Hein Spheres are in case. There's no limitation to the spheres, and not only is there no limitation, so to speak, to the number of spheroids, but each sphere is mispashat ad Ein Sof, because they're not distinguishable as individual spheres and so on. Mash Enkain in Esespheres Agnuzais. By what comes out later, we can extrapolate to what there was before. Nizbaya Sham in what was the Perek Ted Zayin. Nizbaya Sham Zeh Shezeu Shor Shamaku Tzovi Kolmin Malakolami. That these two in Yonim, the or of the Esespheres Agnuzais and the or of the or rather the or of Alas Haratzoin, and prior to Alas Haratzon are the Shoresh of Sovikol Almin and Mamalekol Almin. Prior to Alas Haratzon, Sovikol Almin. Alas Haratzon, Mamalekol Almin, in the Shoresh. And these two things are clearly B'Orein Sof Baruch Hu before the Tzimtzuk Moshkasu, Mizeh B'Erech B'Drush Yom Tov Roshona Samach Vav. So in one of the Mamorim Samach Vav over there, if you have a look at the new Defus of Samach Vav, of Ayin Beis, you'll see the reference, and the reference is to Samach Vav Dav Mem Ches Ve'elach, 48, page 48 following. Okay, V'hina Order Malakol Amin, Haru Nimshach V'chinas Ora Soiviv. It's actually Nimshach from the Ora Soiviv. As I mentioned before, the Kav is Nimshach, or it's Nogea to, it touches the Or Ha'igul Hagodel, the Or of the Or HaSoiviv. Lefi HaMavur Kan, but according to what we explained over here, it's not that the Or Mamale is the Or HaSoiviv, just the Chitzonius of the Or HaSoiviv, or the lowest part of the Or HaSoiviv. It's not that, but they're two distinct inyonim, which are amalgamated one with the other. They're completely integrated one in the other before the Tzimtzum. And the Tzimtzum has the effect of separating the Or HaSoiviv from the Or HaMamale. This is what he's going to explain. Again, Ulfia Mavur Khan Tzarich Loimar, the Ein Zeh Mevchinas Or HaSoiviv Mamish, Hainu Mevchinas Chitzonius, the Or HaBligvul Chulu, Ki'im Shekalul Baha Or HaSoiviv. It's that the Or HaMamale was integrated into the Or HaSoiviv, or integrated with the Or HaSoiviv. Nevertheless, you have to say that it was integrated into the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. It's going to give an example, a beautiful example from the Indian of Tzitzis. From the Torah description of the Indian of Tzitzis, of the mitzvah of Tzitzis. What does it say over there? Shahin min haknaf. That the Tzitzis has to be min haknaf. Ideally, the beged should be wool, and the min that you make the tzitzis of should also be wool. So knaf mina knaf. In other words, the two minim have to be ideally the same thing. Woolen tzitzis potter any beged, but ideally it should be that the beged is wool and the tzitzis are wool as well. Now, are the tzitzis made of the knaf itself, or are the tzitzis a separate entity which are attached to the knaf? The latter is the case, as he will explain. They're not actually, it's not actually the corner of the garment that is made into tzitzis. The knaf hume talis, because the knaf, the corner of the talis, is part of the talis, part of the bigger beged. So the talis represents the inyan of soivev, oir kasalma, right? As you say when you put on your talis, oir kasalma, it's like a sheet that covers over you, a garment that covers over you completely. That's the inyan of the talis, and the knaf is part of that. It's part of the bigger beged. And the chutin of the tzitzis are actually a separate thing that are attached to the knaf. So v'halam Beis chutin the tzitzis, the 32 threads of the tzitzis, shehein lamed Beis the sivas hachachma, because there's 8 threads on each corner times 4 is 32. These are the Lamed Beis Sivas Chochma, the 32 paths of Chochma. Now, the 32 paths of Chochma are the 32 Hamshochas from Chochma to the other spheroids. So that's all the Indian of Or Pnimi. Masha Enkain, the Beged itself, the Talis is the Indian of Or Makif, or the Oyer Kasalma. Masha Enkain, the Tzitzis are Lamed Beis Nesivas Chochma. The Beshorshan, the root of these Lamed Beis Nesivas, in other words, of the Or Pnimi, Hena Eses Hrisak Nuzos. Shorish Bechinas Mamalek Olmi. And Einan Mina Knaf Mamish. They're not actually, according to this Shita anyway, they're not part of the Orein Sof, but the Chitzonius of the Orein Sof, the Chitzonius of the Ora Soivev. They're a different Inyan. They're an Inyan of Alas Haratzo, which makes them a different Inyan from the other Inyonim in the Orein Sof. Einan Mina Knaf Mamish, Shehu, the Knaf is compared to the Orein Sof of Blikvuchul. Nevertheless, the tzitzios are attached to the knaf. Mina knaf, and the same species as the knaf, the same type of material as the knaf. And this is not like the kalim at all. The kalim are an entirely different Indian. Right? Even though the kalim, in other words, the oisius of the Rishimu before the Tzimtzum, are also Ein Sof Mamish. Nevertheless, oisius. Each ois has its particular tzir, its particular Indian, its particular hamshocha. Lavad. They're only the Indian of oisius. In other words, as Guggenheim says, as we learned earlier from David, Yaakov Guggenheim, the sound of the oisius, if you make it into, you bring the waves, and you actually make them into a shape, they make the shape of the oisius in the Aleph base. I haven't read it inside. I heard about it from somebody. I would very much like to read it inside, and I'm going to be looking at it.
He said, and he had the pictures in that book that works for like 10 or 15 letters. For the rest of them, he couldn't make it. But for the majority of the letters.
Interesting. All right, maybe now we have more sophisticated equipment. We can do it nowadays. I don't know. In any event, okay. The oisius, those are kalim. That's a different thing. But here, the shorish oiros are mamish oiros, and therefore, when they're in the oir, they're mamish bottled to the oir, because they are oir. After all, the Indian of the Esesphiris Agnuzis is only a tzir in the oir. It's not a kli, right? It's a tzir of the oir, the way he's been explaining it all along. And therefore, different from the Indian of oisius, the oisius of the Rashimu. When he brought forth the Indian of Oris and Kalim, it says over there, in Tikkun Zohar, right? He and his Chayoi is the Oiros, or one, and he and his Kalim are one. So this is different. These are two different things over here. There's Iwa Chayoy and Iwa Gamoy. Chayoy is the Oiros. And Oiros, even of the Eses Gnuzos, are still called Chayoy. Masha Enkain, the Oises of the Rishimo, that's called Gamoy. Right? And there's two, you'll notice that there's two words Chad over here. There's Chad and Chad. And he's going to explain that there's the two different types of Achdus. There's the Achdus of the Oiros, and there's the achdus of the kalim, two different kinds of oir, two different kinds of achdus. The achdus of the oiros in the oir are completely bebechinas bittul. Masha enken, the achdus of the kalim of the oir is not mamish bechinas bittul mamish, but only subservience, not bittul mamish. Okay, he's going to explain this shortly. Shenemar beis pamim chad. It says over there in the Maimer of the Zohar, beis pamim chad, the two types of chad. The yichud the kalim, yichud the oiros, two different kinds of yichud. The yichud the kalim im oiros, who kamo shnei dvarim hamizyachadim. That the kalim, when the mizyachad with the or, it's like two different things being attached together, being brought together, two different inyonim. But when it comes to the yichud the oiros, in the Ma'atzil Elyon who begins Yichud Dveikus Mamish. It's complete Yichud. It's not a Yichud of two different things coming together, which is really, that Yichud is often called Hiskashrus. Two different entities that come together, that's called Hiskashrus. Masha Ein Kain, when it comes to, and that's the Oris and the Oris and the Kalim. There's an in of Hiskashrus. Hiskashrus the Or to the Kli, and Hiskashrus the Kli to the Or. That's one level of Chad. But a much higher level of Chad is the Inyan of the Yichud and the Dveikus of the Or in the Or. Of the Or Hamatsuyar, in other words, the Tzira Oirois, the Esses Agnuzois, in the Or Ein Sof. So again, Yichud HaOyres B'Matil Elyon Hu B'chinas Yichud Dveikus Mamish. Acha Or Hu Ma'ein HaMa'or. So the Or is like the Ma'or. It becomes like the Ma'or. It's bottle ad kadei kach that all you can see is the Ma'or and not the Or. The Ziv HaShemesh, in the Shemesh, you don't see the Ziv HaShemesh. You only see the Ma'or of the Shemesh. Right? That's all you see. There's no other. And similarly, we could say B'Shoshan Mekorim B'Orein Sof Shelifnei HaTzimtzum, the Shorish Makor of the Esses Spherois, the Esses of the Esses Spherois Aknuzois, Shain Shorish Mamalikol Almin. It's the Shorish of the oil of Mamalikol Almin. Harem Kshurim Yuchani B'Orein Sof B'Or HaSovikol Almin. It's in and bottled to the Or HaSoivev, Harazim Ma'en HaMa'or, and therefore it's Ma'en HaMa'or. Now, what we said before is that the Or HaMamale and the Or HaSoivev are really two different inyonim. But when before the Tzimtzum is Mamish Ma'en, both of them Ma'en HaMa'or, like the Ziv HaShemesh in the Shemesh. It's impossible to distinguish between the two of them. Lagam Shezu B'chinas Or Pnimi, and even though the Indian of the Esosiris like Nuzois, the Indian of Mamalekol Almi is Or Pnimi, Mikom Makom Harizeh Ma'en HaMa'or, Shezeu Indian Mina Knaf. That's exactly the same concept as the concept of Mina Knaf. Yes, it's a separate Indian. It's the Indian Esosiris like Nuzis. It's Alos Harotzoin, and therefore there is a Tziyur in the Or. But the way it is in the Or and so before the Tzimtzum is that it's completely bottled in the Or, and all you can see is the Ma'or. We could say that maybe we could speak about it as at the lowest level of the Or Ein Sof, and that's in fact the way that it's usually spoken about as the Etzema Or, as I've explained many times. The Etzema Or is the highest madrega of the Or. There's the Or Shebegilu La'atzmoi, and there's the Or HaShaykh La'olemis. The Or HaShaykh La'olemis is where the Esses Nuzes are, and that's what we're talking about now. That's the Bechina Acharena Sheba Or Ein Sof. K'mo shekas be'etz Chaim, Sham Emalach Be'inyan Atik, that it says there about the Indian of Atik. What's Atik? Atik of Ak, Atik of Adam Kadmoin. So Atik of Adam Kadmoin is really the Or Ein Sof. It's the Esses Spherois, Hagnuzois, before the Tzimtzum. That's called the Atik of Ak. Atik is Keser, but Pnimius HaKeser, Pnimius HaKeser Ak is the Or, the Esses Spherois Hagnuzois before the Tzimtzum. That's called Atik da Ak. So again, Beinyan Atik da Beinyan Atik, Zeu B'chinas HaYos HaTachtoin Shfeila B'Or Ein Sof. It's the lowest madrega of Or Ein Sof, the Mashofel, so to speak, level. Kvanis Ba'aleo, but there's wow, the Esses like Nuzah B'chinas Atik da Ak. It's the Esses like Nuzahs that are called Atik da Ak. L'chayra and a move on Mashayach Loim B'chinas Acharena, but that was Ein Bo Rosh V'Sof. Now, how can you say that the aspects of Acharena in the Or Ein Sof, when there's no Rosh, there's no Sof? It's Or Ein Sof. So Mela, Ein Sof, Ein Rosh. Ein Rosh, Ein Sof. How do you speak about the Bechina Acharena? Okay. Moshe Shekas Be'etz Chaim Tchila Soy, the Bor Ein Sof, Shehaya Mamale Makom HaChalal, Lo Haya Bo Rosh V'Sof. There was no Rosh and Sof in this Or Ein Sof. So therefore, how can you speak about a Bechina Acharena? There was no Bo Rosh V'Sof, Umalo Matachul. Im Kaim, Mashayach Bazeh Bechinas Acharena Chulu. The Torah Bahabir, the Shcherani Venava, in Shira Shirim, it's got Torah, Likutei Torah, and Shira Shirim. Shcherani, the Hainu Bechinas Or Ha'Ein Sof, Or Ha'Ein Sof. When it says here with chupchik in it, how do you call it, Gershayim or whatever it's called, in the word Or, that's only to emphasize the word Or. It's the Or Ein Sof and not the Ein Sof himself, right? The Ein Sof himself is a Kodesh Baruch Hu Mamish. This is only the Or Ein Sof. The Or is, after all, only an in of Or and Ziv, as he says right now. So it says, it explains in Likutei Torah, how is it possible to talk about a madrega of a madrega tachtoina in the Or? And so because it's only Or, it's not Atzmus. It's not the Ein Sof himself. It's only the Or Ein Sof. It's a Gilu, it's a Ziv, Ha'ora, essentially. Hainu b'chinas Or Ha'Ein Sof. Liyos b'chinas Or v'Ziv b'vad harezeh b'chinas Achreina. Therefore, it can be called Achreina. Sham the Masha Kaza Eitz Chaim and explains in that same mimer what it says in Eitz Chaim b'chinas Hayos Achreina and a kavanah Klolus Or. It's not that all of the Or Ein Sof is in a b'china Achreina. No, there's only an aspect that's b'china Achreina, which we call the Or HaShayich La'Olamus, as we mentioned before. In the Or HaShayich La'Olamus is a madrega, the lowest madrega that Or Ein Sof becomes atik of Adam Kadmoin, and that's the Eses Firis HaGnuzois before the Tzimtzum. That in and of atik of Ak before the Tzimtzum is the Eses Firis HaGnuzois. Shu Inyan his kalus b'chinas mamalik olim be Or Ein Sof hasoy b'kolmi. That's the integration of the Mamale and the Soivev together. So this Inyan of Mamale is Bechinas Hayois HaCharayna Sheba Ein Sof, Sheba Or Ein Sof rather. The in his Kalos Hazois, Umash Or Ein Sof, Abli Gvul, Shir Ba'asmoy, Hamshocha Bechinas Gvul. What's the Inyan of Eses Friz HaGnuzois? Ksha'ala B'ritzoynoi, Shir Ba'atzmoy, Mashi Asid Liyois. Right? It arose in his will that there should be an oilam. V'shir ba'atzmo, he measured out in himself still before the tzimtzum. He thought about like what it would look, how it would look, what's it going to look like. In other words, Malderek Marshall, a person wants to build himself a house. There's only certain things, he's got, let's say, unlimited funds. There's only certain things that are going to satisfy him, right? Only certain inyonim that are going to be what it is that he mamish wants. And a log cabin doesn't come into the picture, and a one-bedroom apartment doesn't come into the picture. He has unlimited possibilities, unlimited capabilities, and therefore he's going to build himself something worthy of the name, right? So that inyan of figuring out what it is that he wants, that's called shi'er ba'atzma b'koyach mash asil yois b'poil. He measures out in himself, in his mind, so to speak, what's going to be in the future. Then between the way it is in the mind, in his ratzon, actually, not even in seichel yet, it's in his ratzon, shir ba'atzma b'koyach, that's to bring ratzon into seichel, and then that has to be brought into dibur, and then dibur has to be brought into ma'isa before it can actually happen. Right, so you can see the number of madregas that it has to go through in order for it to actually be b'poil mamish. So this is called the tzur, in which the tzur hachalomish, the flintstone, in which you have an unlimited, so to speak, number of sparks that could be produced by this tzur hachalomish when you hit it with a piece of metal, right? Can you find those sparks there? Can you see the sparks there? No, but you know that it has the potential to bring out sparks because it's tzur hachalomish. But the sparks are not identifiable therein. In any event, that's the in of Hashara. The Hashara zu, that in of the Hashara is the measuring out what would be in the future is called the lowest level of the Or Ein Sof. And as we said before, this is called Alus Haratzoin. In other words, he measured out himself what it is that he wants. And that's the lowest madrega, because now he's already bringing the tziyur of his ratzon into specifics. He knows exactly what it is that he wants. He measures it out, and he's got a picture in his mind, so to speak, what it is that he wants. And that's obviously, therefore, mugbal, even though it's still in his machshava. There's also what it says in Likutei Torah, the Sefer Shel Bein in Perek Nun Aleph. All right, this is a complicated issue over there in Sefer Shel Bein in Perek Aleph. He talks about the inyan of the nefesh and how the nefesh is mamale kol haguf, in all the ramach evorim of the guf equally, right? It's not that there's any chilukim in the nefesh. In any event, he explains this in Likutei Torah and at great length. So, being in koiches nefesh, he explains that in koiches nefesh, she'enan atzmus nefesh el taryag mina koiches v'chayes klulim bo chulu, v'hein mislapshim b'moyach v'al der moyach nimshach l'chol ha'evorim. From the so it goes through the whole process until it actually becomes melubash in a specific aver, and that's what he explains over there in Likutei Torah. Let's not get into too much, digress too much. If you want to look it up there, it'd be a good thing to do. The Hanimshal, so the Nimshal is the koiches are kluli benefesh hu inyan eses v'zagnuzos. The way the koiches are before they're melubash in the evarim, but there's a potential to be melubash in the evarim, and this koich in that aver, another koich in a different aver, and this koich cannot go into the first aver because it's not shaykh to that aver, and so on and so forth. In other words, there's distinctions in the eses v'zagnuzos, even though it's distinctions without a difference, so to speak. There's distinctions, but because the eses v'zagnuzos are bottled in the or ein sof before the tzimtzum, those differences are not recognizable. They're not discernible. But nevertheless, there are differences which you can extrapolate from what happens later on. So as they klulim, so it's like the koiches and nefesh klulim in the nefesh. Haklulim in nefesh. Who in essence is like nuzos between his atik the ak, and as we said before, that the Indian is of atik of ak. In other words, the tziyur of the or of the essence spheres like nuzos before the tzimtum becomes atik of ak. Haklulim or in sofa bligvul, but it's as yet still in or in sofa bligvul. The Indian is kalus Indian hashora hano. The siskalulus of the or in the bligvul is the hashora. In other words, it's still differentiated as far as he's concerned, although we can't see the differentiation, but there is a differentiation. He was already shi'er b'koyach masha asi liyos b'poil, so it has some kind of tziyur, and that's the hashor. Mizeh move on. Sorry, mizeh nimshach hakav shemislavish b'chinas arich declalus ha'olemes, and from there comes the kav. So there's first the essence is like nuzois, and then the kav is nimshach. The kav is mamshich. The Indian of the essence is like nuzois. The tzir or that there was in the essence is like nuzois is nimshach into the kav. A kav mislamish b'chinas arich the klalus ha'olemes hana b'chinas akhulu. And that becomes the inyonim, the various madrigas in Ak. That's the Kav is, as the result says, after the Tzimtzum, the Kav was, there was a Kav Dak Or that was Nimshach into the Halal, and Choizim is Agel, Choizim is Agel, Choizim is Agel. It makes 10 circles around within the perimeter, inside the perimeter of the Halal, and those are called the Esses Spherois, of Igulim, that later the Kav comes down in two forms. There's the Kav is Nimshach into Igulim, Choizer, the Nimshach, Choizer, Nimshach, etc. The Choizer, as it goes around, that becomes the series of Igulim, and Nimshach is the Indian of the Kav, the Indian of Sadish Toshalus, the Indian of not Hamshochas Makifim, that's the Igulim, but the Hamshochas or in Adam Yoshar, right? There's Igulim and then there's Yoshar. That Yoshar is the or that's Nimshach down from Milamal Lamata, and that's the Ika Indian of the Kav. Okay, but Nimtza, so it comes out. Therefore, the Bechinas Esses Spheres are Klulim Bor Ein Sof. Zeh Bechinas Acharenish Bor Ein Sof. Therefore, the Esses Spheres like Nuzois are Bechinas Acharena or Ein Sof. And we understand what Acharena means now. It means that there's a tziyur in the or of what will be in the future, and that's Esses Spheres like Nuzois, and later becomes the or that's Nimshach into the Kav. And in a general sense, we call it Malchus the Ein Sof. All of the Inyonim happen in Malchus the Ein Sof. Malchus the Ein Sof is the Or HaShaych LaOlemes. Vagam the Or Ein Sof Obligvu and the Shaykh is Spheres. Kim Spheres Ein Keizchur. Even though the Or Ein Sof itself, you can't say the Indian of Es Spheres. Certainly not the Indian of Spheres Malchus. It's Spheres Ein Keiz. Masha Enka and the spheroids are mugbalim. There's a tzir to the spheroids. So how does that happen? Ayin who the hinan is bar up the character Zion. The spheres ein kain ze hainu shem beginners bli gvul. All these spheres there beginners bli gvul. Omnam hashores ham shocha, when the sheer ba'asma b'koyach ba'ash asil liyos b'poil, that's the hashora, that's the hamshocha, that's a tziyur, that's a hagbola in the or, even though it's as yet not mugbal b'poil. Onam hashores hamshocha beginners gvul yesh leims de beginners a malchus b'ein sof. That all takes place in malchus of ein sof, that eventually becomes the Indian of or hamamale. So malchus b'ein sof a bligvul chulu. And it says compare what we say later to what we say over here or whatever. Malchus is called the regel. Why? Because it's the levar migufa, right? You have the torso, which is called gufa. There's the roish, and then there's the torso, and then there's the raglaim, right? The head, the torso, and the legs. So the legs are lebar migufa, as it says, right? They're outside of the goof. They're an extension of the goof, but they're not mamish part of the goof, not part of the torso. Lafi shebava al yada, that through the union of regel, hamshochem olam elyon olam atachtoin. That's what is nimshach from the higher world to the lower worlds, the union of the raglayim, the lebar migufa, the chitzonius, the lowest level. From one state to another state, when he has a mehus, it doesn't mean mehus in any mehus and metzias. It doesn't mean in that sense. It means from one entity to another entity, from one reality to another reality. That's what we mean over here, right? In other words, from Atzilus to Biyah. So the legs of Atzilus are what are nimshach to Biyah, so to speak. In other words, what are the legs? Netzach Hod Yesod. And essentially Malchus, which is what we're talking about. It's Netzach Hod Yesod, Malchus that are nimshach into the Olam HaTachton. And if you see in certain diagrams in Kisvei Arizal, you'll see that the way it looks is like this. You have sort of like cones going into one another, like sort of cones. The bottom third of every cone is what is nimshach into the top third of the cone below it. Right, so you have a cone, and the bottom third of that cone is attached to or touches the top third of the cone below it. That's the raglayim that correspond to the that are melubash in the Chabad of the madrega below. So the raglayim of, in other words, Netzach Hod Yesod Malchus of Atzilus are melubash in Chabad of Bria. The Raglaim Netzach Hod Yesod Malchus of Bria are melubash in Chabad of Yetzirah, and so on. That's how it works. We could say the same thing is true to a certain extent before the Tzimtzum, in the Oren Sof before the Tzimtzum, the Hashora Liyos Amshocha, that the Hashora that will be later on Nimshach as an or prati as a tziyur in the oil, and it'll become the Esesphiris Agnuzos that are Nimshach into the Oilimis. In other words, they'll become the Esesphiris Agluyos eventually, the revealed spheroids. So that is the same kind of idea. That's the Raglayim of the higher Madrega on Nimshach into the Rosh of the lower Madrega. More can Yeshloim or in social Tzimtzum, the Hashara, Liyos Hamshocha, that there will be Hamshocha, Shebechinas Gvul, Zebechinas Malchus, that's the lowest Madrega. I explained as Netzach Hod Yesod Malchus, the Ikar is Malchus, obviously, because that's the Malchus of the higher Oilam becomes Keser of the lower Oilam, right? But in general, it's explained as Netzach Hod Yesod and Malchus of the higher Oilam or Melubash in Chabad of the lower Oilam. Okay, Kitzur, Ba'adug Mizeh, Yuben Lamaila, the Koram HaTzimtzum, Haya Oren Sof Meir Begiloi, all Esesudis Agnuzos. So the Esesudis Agnuzos were, so to speak, buried and integrated into the Oren Sof before the Tzimtzum. V'atzimtzum Yabesh Nai Inyonim, and the Tzimtzum therefore brought about two Inyonim. First of all, the Ora Kloli was Nistalek, Siluk Or Ha'ein Sof, the Ora Kloli. Yeah, Atzilus sphere is achas pratis, and then a single sphere, a single bechina, a single aspect, single inyan was nimshach, like the letter base from the word baruch. Vazeu shosha oiros, sorry, deina shosha oiros hein ma'ain bechinas or ein sof. The shosha oiros as they are in the or ein sof before the tzimtzum are ma'ain hama'or, ma'ain bechinas or ein sof. And that we explained was al derech halacha was the min haknaf min haknaf, that the oil of the Esesphiris Agnuzois before the Tzimtzum is min haknaf. It's the same as the or in sof. It's ma'en hamaor. And we could say that in the or of the Esesphiris Agnuzois is the achrayna shabaor. Ki inyan is kalulus and ba'or in sof, who or in sof abligu shir ba'asmer laha'i v'chinas gvul. Because the whole union of these Esesphiris Agnuzois is shir ba'asmer v'koyach ma'ashas liyos bepoil. And Lasel Yos Bepel means that he would be later on Meir Bebchinas Gvul, that the or would come to the union of Gvul. Vasharazu Bebchinas Malchus, and that's called Malchus. Vayakol Kalul rather, but it's off before the Tzimtzum. So before the Tzimtzum, everything was included there, but nevertheless there was a tzir in the or. All right, if there's any questions, then we have to take them. You can unmute yourself if you want, and we'll go from there. We're good? All right. Looks like there's no questions. Alrighty, folks. I think next week we probably finish the mimer. I don't know if we'll actually finish it. We'll finish the next chapter, but I'm not sure we'll finish the mimer. We'll see. All right.
Shkoich.
Okay, Zagazut, everybody.
Gesund.